I'm Paul Mozur. I'm a reporter with the New York Times. I cover technology in the region. And we were just discussing the sort of fraught situation in China at the moment. A bunch of reporters with the New York Times were forced to leave China earlier this year, and I was one of them. It was a punishment, of course, but there are also many moments where it feels kind of nice because you look at the kind of how tense things have gotten there and some of the punishments that are being doled out to journalists these days. And, it just feels like the situation has gotten increasingly fraught, and Sophia is still there and dealing with that. So we were discussing how difficult that is and how even post-COVID, the stress kind of remains.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. I'm Sophia Yan. I'm the China correspondent for the Daily Telegraph. And Paul's right. It's not easy to be here. The environment for freedom of speech has changed drastically, especially for people working in journalism. And it's just this really slippery slope that we just keep coming down, and there's no telling when we're going to stop and what might bring things to a halt. It's really unprecedented, the sort of level of the circumstances here, the level of the seriousness of the circumstances that we face here. And for the remaining journalists that are here, some expelled and then some who have been stranded because of the pandemic. Borders are still closed here in China, and it's just been really rough for the remaining few that are still around here. But hopefully we can bring you some interesting insights from, I guess, Paul, you're in Taipei, right? From between Taipei and Beijing. Yeah. Cool. Great. Well, I guess I'll just launch into some opening remarks. We're talking about data collection and censorship during COVID in China. So I'll do the censorship part, and then Paul will jump in with data collection. Then we'll just open for questions. We're happy to take as many as you guys all have. We're happy for an open discussion. All right. So I guess let's go all the way back to January, beginning of the year, 2020. Cold winter in Beijing. And when the coronavirus first emerged here, a lot of people in China had no idea what was going on. Even within Wuhan, many didn't know that the entire city was dealing with this potential epidemic until everything was locked down. And of course, that was followed by the rest of Hubei province also being locked down. Now, for a lot of people following this back at the start of the year, there was a bit of hope that after SARS, that perhaps Beijing wouldn't again make the same kind of mistake, by suppressing information, which is of course crucial in a public health crisis. But in the early reporting that I did, and also reporting that my colleagues did, showed us that China simply wasn't giving the world the full picture. Hospitals clearly were immediately overwhelmed, even when the official death toll was just a few dozen. I interviewed one man whose stepmother had died, likely of COVID, but her death was never counted as she was never tested for the virus. And she died within 10 days of the onset of symptoms and was diagnosed with a cold and turned away from 3 hospitals in Wuhan. They simply didn't have any space. By the time she was put in isolation, she was already in very critical condition, and she died 6 hours later. Her death, that was January 15th. And at the time, China had said the death toll was about 40 people. And the details that have come out, that have trickled out since, of suppressed whistleblowers like Dr. Li Wenliang, and also information about these local political meetings that were happening, this period of time when for some reason the number of infections somehow remained static, give us in retrospect a much fuller picture of how much information control was really going on. In the midst of crisis for governments, of course, they're challenged between disseminating enough of the right kind of information so people can protect themselves, but also doing it in a very responsible way as to stem mass panic. And balance to strike in China, where the routine playbook has always included censorship. Too much information could lead to instability and challenges for the ruling Communist Party, but too little information in the initial stages, as we have all seen in this pandemic, can have absolutely devastating consequences. Now, to this day, in China, authorities are still trying to control the narrative. Beijing has expelled nearly 20 foreign journalists in the first half of this year. Citizen journalists disappeared, some still under state supervision. Propaganda messaging has been going really strong for months now, declaring utter victory in what party leader Xi Jinping has called the people's war against the virus. And it's not a hard sell given the state of affairs in other countries. At this point, Beijing is just so eager to brush all of these issues that had happened at the start of the pandemic under the rug and is clearly now preparing to call itself a winner in the global vaccine race. Just yesterday, I attended a government-arranged tour of Sinovac. They're producing one vaccine, which is one of the 4 candidates, Chinese-developed candidates, in phase 3 clinical trials. China's got more vaccines in these last-stage human tests than any other country. But even with all this success that's being touted as the official line, it doesn't mean that everyone is necessarily willing to believe the story. I spent 2 weeks in Wuhan. I arrived just before lockdowns lifted, and I left after they were finally relaxed. And what I found there was that, a lot of people, even though that they were relieved that the war seemed to be over, that they could try to put it behind them, a lot of them really doubted what the government had said and had told them. At this point, there are 5 lawsuits that have been filed in Hubei courts against the government for its botched handling, which families are alleging led to the untimely death of their loved ones. And these people are very brave. To file this lawsuit, a lot of the ones who wanted to seek reparations weren't able to. They were harassed and intimidated by the police to the point where they dropped their plans to file. So these 5 who have done it, it's really taking a big step. In so many ways, the more eager I think China is to declare it all clear in this pandemic and potentially to name itself as the global savior in this, with this vaccine to the rescue. It seems the more intense censorship and suppression of dissent becomes, because there couldn't possibly be an alternate narrative to challenge the government's accounts. And I'll just conclude here with one last bit for thought, and I'm happy to discuss as we go. But the world, I think, really needs to do some deep thinking about the implications of China's trend toward greater censorship. With the pandemic, the looming question really still is, by how much did China's actions exacerbate this outbreak that we're all still living? And more broadly, is there a recalibration needed in how countries ought to be dealing with this increasingly emboldened and aggressive China on the world stage? So I'll toss to Paul.
Sure. Yeah, so to take up the kind of the surveillance side of things, COVID was a fascinating moment because, if you study the Chinese surveillance system, this was a moment where, the muscles could truly be flexed, right? I mean, the idea that, for the past few years, Xi Jinping has invested immense amounts of government money into building out the police apparatus to kind of keep tabs on where people are, what they do, watch their phones, monitor them. And the idea within the party has broadly been that such intense surveillance in a way can be a runaround of democratic kind of processes. The idea is that, if you are able to monitor what people say and do all the time, then you know what they're happy and unhappy about, and you can respond more efficiently. And I think what was really interesting, in particular with Li Wenliang, who was, a doctor who basically tried to warn people about a SARS-type virus very early on and was ultimately pulled in by the internet police and questioned, this is the type of thing that we'd seen happening a lot over the past few years in China. So, increasing numbers of people for simply, saying, either making fun of Xi Jinping or saying something that's sort of talking out of line, you'll get a knock on the door now from the internet police. And so that's what happened to a doctor who's trying to kind of be an early whistleblower. And so while you have this sort of belief in the center that, we're doing such a good job monitoring all this information, we can respond quickly, we don't even need the kind of checks and balances of a democratic system, what actually happened is that the exact moment when you would want to be listening to what people are saying and using it as a way to kind of listen to the sort of alarm bells, what actually happened is those alarm bells were silenced, in part by that kind of overwhelming surveillance. So that was one kind of interesting moment. Another thing is sort of once the virus, started progressing and the lockdown started happening, we started seeing different kind of technological kind of solutions to deal with things. And so one of the big ones we saw with these things called health codes. And Sophia knows, like, you sort of live and die by your health code when you were trying to travel around China during COVID. What the health code was effectively, the Chinese police and the Chinese government got together with a couple of different tech companies, and it was done province by province. And they basically created a software built into the messaging apps, which are so ubiquitous that you almost can't not have them, WeChat and Alipay. And ultimately built this system where, and they never really explained what data it was based on, but if you had a green code, it meant you were okay and you didn't have COVID and you could go out. If you had a yellow code, it meant you probably had to quarantine for a week or two. If you had a red code, it meant you probably should stay at home indefinitely. And they kind of launched this overnight, and it's kind of breathtaking to think of the kind of level of social experiment this was. I mean, imagine if overnight everybody's Facebook, had a government sort of code put into it, and you had to have Facebook. And not only did you have to have Facebook to leave, then this code had to function on your phone properly. And so a lot of people were stuck inside with sort of mysterious red codes. Others, say the elderly, didn't know how to watch it, how to sort of make it work. So we actually sat and watched it at a train station where old people would come through every so often at the subway trying to get on, and they didn't actually know how to open their code. And so the people at the subway station, the guards had to actually show them, and then people kind of sort of brush through and so on. So it's this very kind of strange thing where you have the government imposing on people a private technology solution that's combined with a government solution. And of course, the whole time the data that's being collected is also going back to the government, and they weren't explicit about it. So one of the articles we wrote sort of focused on the Alibaba health code. And though it was collecting, basically, if you used it, it seemed like it was an Alibaba product, but in fact, it had been developed with the Hangzhou police. And when we looked at the code, sure enough, they were sending data locations back to the police as a part of this. And so that gets to kind of like a broader thing, which was, there are quite a few different sort of stovepipes of data within the Chinese surveillance system. And, one of the sort of questions is, if you start lifting those restrictions and sharing that data, what happens? And over time, do you get rid of that data in the long run, or do you store it? And so we don't really know the answer to that. And I think most likely a lot of that data did stick around. So for instance, you have a company like CETC, which is a sort of major Chinese state-run technology company with deep ties to the military and intel services and so on. And they were given a bunch of telecom data, a bunch of train data, and all this stuff. And they created a software tool that was on the internet where you could enter your phone number, your name, and your basically national ID number, and see if you had been exposed to COVID potentially, on a train or wherever, when you're traveling through some county. And ultimately, we didn't really know what data was going into it, how sophisticated the system was. But what we do know is, there were hundreds of millions of people who used this system. So every single person who entered a name, a phone, and an ID number, that goes into a database. And those three pieces of information, linking them together is actually harder than you would think. And a lot of local police departments will try very hard to link that data. And now all of a sudden you have 400 million people kind of voluntarily entering that data because they're so worried about COVID. And we saw this again with the telecoms in China, where the telecoms themselves opened sort of access to where your phone had roamed. So they can track, where your phone pings different base stations and determine where you were. And so they actually opened up this system where, your phone, if you sent a certain text message to your telecom, your phone would respond with all of the different places where your phone had been over the past 2 weeks. And what I think is so fascinating about this is it's not the technology itself. The technology isn't sophisticated enough to truly control what people do. What you do is, what China does is they put guards everywhere. So you need the people as well. And so the people are sitting there saying, show me your phone, enter this text message, let's see where you've been. And that was how they would sort of check people at train stations and, in subways and so on, to see if they had been in a different place and potentially at risk of spreading COVID or lying about, their quarantine status. So I guess, there's all these different kind of, sort of issues going on at once. And at the end, what probably happened is one of the sort of most large-scale data harvesting events and data sharing events we've ever seen in a system that was already sort of, sucking in more data than you could possibly believe, and all sort of in a consolidated way. And we don't know what happened to that data, and nobody knows. And there were some alarm bells. The Chinese public has pushed back in some cases where, these health codes, some pioneering local officials said, we want to use these health codes to create an honesty index. And then, we can judge people based on how much sleep they got and how forthright they've been. And people pushed back against that. And you do see that in sort of the elite, first tier cities on the East Coast, but in other places it's much harder to. And more broadly, where there's more opacity, we just don't know what happened to that data. So most likely that data is now fueling a kind of new, more muscular surveillance system, and will go into the next generation of technologies. So I guess I ranged a little far from COVID, but it is interesting how COVID has become an interesting excuse for authoritarian kind of overplay, and that's, I think, one of the things we did see during this period in China.
We're just getting some questions here. Here's one. Are the health codes here to stay and something that will be expanded upon moving forward, or are they being phased out? Which I think, Paul, ties into what you were just saying in terms of this whole, all these apps that have come into play. There are issues with them. Sometimes they're a little faulty. Sometimes they don't necessarily load the code as necessary. If you, for instance, are traveling from Beijing and you return, you have to put in every place you've been down to the district level. And sometimes the app's a little faulty and you have to really jigger it a little bit to give you your green health code. It's not always really clear exactly where your phone has pinged. And so it's up to the person to be able to put in the correct data. And it can be really difficult because sometimes those pings happen and again, you have no idea. So it's just putting in all this information. And it's unclear, as Paul said, where it goes, who's got access to it. And because China seems to have controlled the virus so well, it really does give them a way to say that this kind of data collection and context tracing, this kind of information is important and that it should in fact stay. I mean, there have already been some proposals about expanding these programs to be broader health programs to track what people are doing. And just the fact that they have been able to roll them out so quickly and use them to their advantage, I think gives the government a lot of room to say, hey, these should stay. But people are concerned about the invasiveness of this. I've been actually quite surprised. There's definitely a subset of people who think that the government has done a great job. They think that these tools are necessary, but that doesn't mean that there isn't concern about privacy and what that means going forward. And there's another category of people who are concerned where the country's going politically. And this kind of data collection, this pretty intrusive collection of what you're doing, where you're going, who you're with, it falls into that category. And yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I guess just to add a little bit to that, I think, one way to think about this is it's all about teaching the public and normalizing certain things. The more you get used to using certain things, the more, if you leave them in place, there's less resistance. And so just getting people used to the idea that there are going to be checkpoints everywhere where your phone will have to be looked at and scrutinized, and that your phone is tracking and sharing information, and that's just the way it is a really important kind of moment in just sort of public awareness for, teaching people how to use the technology. And I do think a lot of officials have sort of seized on that and looked at other ways they can use it. And even if, in the most part, these kind of overzealous officials are pushed back, and people do complain. And it's important to remember there is a lot of data privacy concern in China because there's just an immense amount of leaks out of these various companies and government surveillance systems. Even if people push back, you will get sort of, the center line will move a little bit. And so then the next time we have something, the center line will move again, and eventually people will get normalized to these things. And I think like, just like social credit, where it was an overblown sort of idea, but nonetheless the idea was kind of put into place, and you did see it sort of rolled out in certain places. Now again, we have another idea where, okay, we're going to watch people collect their data, get them used to it, and then in the long run we can keep pushing it that way. And a final thought on that is, in first tier cities, it's easy for the wealthy and the privileged to push back against this, but in sort of more impoverished areas or places where people don't have as much power, it's much easier to impose stricter guidelines. So it wouldn't surprise me if in places like Xinjiang, places like Tibet, kind of more rural areas, we do see a deeper kind of, use of something like this to mark people and track them. And so I do think it's kind of a glimpse of the future, even if it's a little too quick, and it will take a while to get there. Sophia, did you see what's next? What's a good one?
Just looking at these different questions. So a lot are coming in. Okay. All right, so these next couple of questions are a little bit linked. In the beginning of the pandemic, we saw the Chinese government tightly control the news and likely downplay the infection numbers. Is this control of public opinion still going on, or has the situation in China improved to a point that this is now more relaxed? Definitely still a lot of control of public opinion. I mean, you just take a look at the state media, the kind of propaganda that's coming through. There's still, there are people in Wuhan and other parts of China who are upset with how the government handled the outbreak. They had loved ones who died. They couldn't get access to hospitals, even people who, there was one family I met in Wuhan, for instance, a man's father had a chronic illness, a kidney disease, and he was not able to get to the hospital for dialysis, which he really needed. And so his son thinks his father's health, I mean, his father had this condition that just really worsened because he wasn't able to get this care that was necessary because of the lockdowns. And so it's not even just people who had who dealt with COVID health-wise, but also other illnesses. And so there's a lot of concern about what that period of time in Wuhan meant and what it really meant for a lot of people who had to deal with the worst of it all, which is losing a relative. And that kind of sentiment hasn't gone away. I mentioned earlier some of these lawsuits that have been filed. There is definitely traction in terms of people who want to seek reparations from the government. That is, of course, really difficult here with the kind of data collection and privacy intrusion of how much the government can get into your life to know what you're doing, what you're saying. I mean, even with these groups that were trying to arrange to seek reparations, whether it was some sort of payment from companies or from the quarantine hotels where they thought that the care or the food that was provided to the relatives wasn't enough or wasn't nutritious enough, to hospitals, to all these different parts of the system that were dealing with potential patients and these illnesses. I mean, there's a lot of people are really upset. That hasn't gone away, and there's a sense of unease in a way that there's in perhaps a chance that people in Wuhan will never really know what happened. They don't totally buy the government line, and I think that is something that will stick around for a while. It might abate a little bit if China does win this global vaccine race. I think the government's probably really banking on that. The government, these central government officials, hoping that being able to win that vaccine race will mean that they can deflect some of this global anger and also concern at home about how they dealt with the pandemic. So definitely, I think this control of what people are saying, what people are thinking about COVID and the handling of COVID, it's definitely still at play. There's an official government timeline. It's the official timeline, and it just glosses over a lot of these early missteps. I was called into the foreign ministry, for instance. This is sort of a pretty frequent occurrence with foreign journalists here these days. They call you in for a cup of tea, and it's a bit of a dressing down about your work. And the whole meeting was just him reading down this official timeline of what the government had done and why all the steps it took were good steps. And it's just their way of trying so hard to control the message through every part of that system, from what their citizens are consuming online and social media, from what's broadcast on state media, what's printed in state media newspapers, down to what even foreigners are writing and broadcasting about what's going on here in China.
Yeah, and I think you can't overstate how successful that has been as well in a lot of ways. It's impossible to know for certain. As Sophia said, there's a lot of people who sort of, are pressing for reparations and so on. But, I remember the night that Li Wenliang had died, I'd never seen Chinese social media look like that before. I mean, just every single person was posting about his death, and every single person was sort of angry and upset and kind of freaked out. And it's just almost impossible to think of a symbol of something, of excess government censorship, sort of trending so widely. And the only thing I could really think back to was the Wenzhou train crash back in 2011, when again, the kind of narrative got really far away from the censor's kind of control, and it almost, it was sort of shocking and surprising. And so to go from that moment where the entire country was mourning somebody who was sort of silenced by the government, who could have been a whistleblower and was not, to 2 months later where you just have sort of, incredible nationalism and an outpouring of pride at sort of how, China handled the virus and sort of, the way that they were able to sort of control that sentiment, was done through probably the largest censorship operation they've ever undertaken. Just talking to people about the posts that they would put up and would go down, people who were trying to save posts before they got deleted, just the raw level of opinion control that happened over those few months is remarkable. And the fact is, it feels kind of successful. Like when you talk to people, they do, that sort of part of that memory of the early days, of COVID is sort of gone in some ways. I mean, what you really get is this kind of, pride and this sort of, overflowing of sort of, sort of nationalist spirit in a way. I mean, not in everybody, of course, you don't want to fully generalize, but, pretty heavily. And so it's just incredible to imagine that a government can control that in such a sort of stark way. And I think the government feels emboldened by that. And so I think, everything that we're seeing is there's even more doubling down on opinion management, opinion control, kind of trying to do these, these sorts of, sort of computer-led opinion guidance systems. And so I think we'll see a lot more of it, frankly. And we can maybe jump back to an earlier question. Somebody asked, how do you respond to people who argue that coercive mechanisms could be useful in a pandemic situation, even at the expense of civil rights? Sophia, do you have any thoughts on that? I can also jump in because I think it's an interesting sort of debate. Oh, are you muted?
All right, there we go. Can you hear me now?
Great.
Yeah, this is an interesting question, especially when it comes to China. Before COVID, there was actually a fairly robust data privacy debate, which is not necessarily something you think of. You think China, you think the government, this authoritarian government, just kind of tracking your moves. I mean, it's not the fact that consumer privacy would factor into any sort of discussion is not something that seems like it would be the case here necessarily, but it was. And I think with COVID, it's really changed. I mean, there is still a sense that this is quite intrusive. And there's concern about what it means in the long run if these programs, these health codes are expanded and they stay, and how much more data might be collected. But that data privacy debate, I think in so many ways is going to get snuffed out because of how things have gone with COVID and the contact tracing. I mean, in so many ways, it has been quite successful, even if it has to rely a bit on a human component, as Paul was saying, to enforce quarantines and to make sure that you did go where you say you did and things like that. But these systems are only getting stronger. They really are in China. I just wanted to jump back a little bit about, Paul, what you were saying before about how these, the sort of the propaganda line, to not discount how much people have bought into it. That's certainly true. And it's actually easier in some ways for people here to buy into it while the rest of the world is sort of still burning from the pandemic. There's been a lot of anti-foreign sentiment in China in general leading up to the pandemic, and now even more so. And even though there's a bit of, there's difference in opinion in terms of how the government handled the pandemic. A lot of people do think the government did a good job, but of course there's a group of people who don't think that. But even still, there is this interesting nationalist sentiment that gets really stoked up when the government starts talking about sort of anti-foreign forces that are trying to mess with the Chinese people or the Chinese dream or the Chinese government. And it's really remarkable how that can really resonate with the people here. And there's this greater sense, I think, for China on the world stage to become more aggressive. And as that happens, it's part of this collective sense that actually the rest of the world shouldn't be dumping on China for XYZ. In this case, it's poor handling of the pandemic in the early days. It's really remarkable, I think, in terms of how people sort of band together and share this sentiment. And it's so easy in so many ways for the government to bring that out.
Yeah, I mean, I remember being, it feels so long, I almost forget about this, but, when, Zhao Lijian brings up the idea that the U.S. brought the virus, this sort of conspiracy theory that the U.S. planted the virus in Wuhan via this, like, what was it, like a military games.
Yeah. Which hilariously enough, one of the field hospitals in Wuhan, ironically enough, I guess, it was built on top of the site where they held the World Military Games. Anyway.
Good use for the space. But when that came out, I mean, I remember like when that came out, I just sort of, it was such a preposterous thing, and you know, sort of started asking around, and I was amazed at how many people I knew actually believed it, or people who would say, oh, well, you know, like, it's not that I believe it, it's just that, like, I don't know what happened, and I'm not sure anymore, but, like, I think maybe it wasn't, you know, we don't know where it came from, so who knows, but it could be the US, we don't know. And I think, you know, if you have all of the official kind of lines firing on that, it is easy, and nobody wants where they're from to be sort of the source of a global catastrophe, right? And so if you can kind of inject enough sort of doubt in people's minds that, you know, they're happy to kind of go on and say, well, actually, we don't really know what happened, and you know, they'll be content with that. So I think it is amazing how you can kind of lead people down that path. And I think, I forget what book it was, it might have been, gosh, well, one of the many recent Trump books sort of talked about how on one of the calls, you know, Trump and Xi were discussing the virus, and Trump actually brought up that remark, and they actually argued about it, and then Xi changed the subject. And so, I mean, you know, so even at a kind of like, you know, head of state to head of state terms, they were sort of debating this issue, which seems wild, you know. So yeah, so I mean, it's just, you know, it's remarkable. But I mean, you know, we're seeing the same, I think it is interesting because you see the same sorts of phenomenon on global social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, elsewhere, you know, where you have smaller kind of filter bubbles where people can kind of believe their own reality, and the reality can kind of swirl away from sort of real reality. And I do think within China, you have a kind of larger, almost mega filter bubble that they are able to whip up in the party and government are able to whip up with the combination of censorship and propaganda. And with enough time, you know, with enough people kind of, you know, if all you can see online are these sorts of narratives, then you'd be kind of crazy not to believe them at some point, right? Unless you're a very sophisticated person, a very skeptical person, or somebody who gets out of China a lot, you know, or jumps the Great Firewall, and that there's just not that many people like that. You know, people have real other lives to live, you know, and there are other things to do, so they just aren't so focused on that. So I think, yeah, I mean, we shouldn't be so surprised. But anyway, Sophia, see anything interesting?
Can you talk a little bit more about the disinformation campaign that the Chinese government seemed to push during the pandemic, such as the virus originating from the US? Yeah, there were a lot of lines. It's amazing how many different origin threads were coming from different people. I mean, everybody I bet in Wuhan, I asked them where they thought the virus came from, and there was one that really stuck out to me, which was that it had to have originated from the US because they had so many cases, and that the US had started developing a vaccine quite early. So why would they have done that if it didn't come from the US? There are just so many rumors flying around, and with the way things are geopolitically between China and the US, US is an easy scapegoat. The way the US has been pushing China, it's convenient for China to push back and say, hey, actually, our problems aren't really our problems. You gave us those problems. And it's a line, again, that plays well with the general public because of this nationalist pride and sentiment. I mean, in many ways, Xi Jinping's line about the Chinese dream has really been pretty effective, I would say. It's given people some sort of collective slogan or an idea to rally around. And maybe they don't always believe it 100% of the time, but it is amazing that when the country is under attack, that the government is able to take that line and stoke these feelings amongst their people. It's really interesting to see and watch.
Yeah, and it's quite scary too at times. It's just sort of the power, and I mean the xenophobia was sort of dramatic, and we really saw. As that anger got whipped up, one of the things that I thought was really interesting is after a while, as this debate about the origin of the virus was happening internationally, whenever the Chinese state media would announce new virus cases, most of them were being imported from people flying back from overseas. But they wouldn't specify that the people flying back from overseas were Chinese. They would just say imported from overseas. And so that sort of upped this idea that it was just foreigners coming in from outside of China, bringing with them the virus. And so that made things far worse. And I mean, it was, I don't know if people recall the sort of, what happened in Guangzhou, but, this is an area with traditionally a large African trading community. And, basically Black people were locked away in hotels for 2 weeks and then given an arbitrary addition of 2-week quarantine. And, there's this real outburst of kind of racially driven, quarantine punishment aimed at foreigners, and it caused an international incident between China and a number of different African countries. And then personally, I had, my last reporting trip before leaving China, I went to Anhui province, and we were just sitting down eating at a McDonald's and sort of lamenting a terrible trip because we were followed by police everywhere we went. And this guy got in our face and started yelling at me, calling me a foreign piece of trash and saying, "Get out of my country, what are you doing here?" And then, my Chinese colleagues started yelling back at him. And such is the paranoia of reporting in China that you don't really know if this guy's a setup and, he's there to kind of prompt you to do something so that they can drag you in and interrogate you further. So, she starts going at him, and I have to stop her and be like, "All right, like calm down," and just sort of shut up and let him just sort of yell at me for a while before he wanders off. And so, yeah, it's incredibly scary to see that. And I think the levels of xenophobia people probably don't appreciate, but they were very extreme. I mean, people walking to the other sides of the roads, like, not willing to sit next to you on the subway. I mean, all kinds of stuff. And I think that will persist for a while, probably. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely still around. It's difficult for foreigners to stay in certain hotels right now, to travel around. I mean, even that's sort of jumping across the street because there's a foreign-looking person walking near you. That's still happening. People moving away, moving their kids away. It's just it's really deep-rooted, that kind of racism that's come across. And it's amazing, I often, in the last couple of weeks as things have opened, I've been trying to go more to parks to do some long walks and just get some outdoor time. But every time I try to go into one of these parks, I have to get a ticket. I have to show a health code. I have to give ID. And because it's a passport, I always have to fill out extra information as part of their their contact tracing methods. And there's always a big fuss about whether or not I can be allowed in, because there's always a concern that I've just come into the country. In fact, the borders have been closed. Foreigners have not been able to come into the country, into China, very easily. There have been more groups coming in thus far, but they've all had to get special permission. So it's not like in mass foreigners have come and brought the virus to China. But that is a really difficult line to sort of correct in what people understand. Most Chinese people I've talked to don't even realize that the borders have been closed and that foreigners actually couldn't come and go freely. And it goes back to what Paul was saying, that the line that was being used, it was imported infections. And so there was a sense that it was being brought in from outside, when in fact a lot of those infections were, and still are, Chinese who are repatriating, Chinese who are living and working abroad, who are finding their way slowly back home. So I do agree that that sense will stay for a while. And again, as globally the tensions rise between China and the West, it's hard to see how on a person-to-person level that this is going to improve.
Yeah, and I will say, after having left China, which, Sophia, you haven't done yet. I won't say yet. We'll just say hasn't happened. And but when you leave, it was kind of incredible, because there are so many checkpoints and so many people who are just sort of deputized to check your data and to understand whether or not you're a threat. And that their judgment is based on very little, is often arbitrary, and especially if you look different, is going to be based on sort of whatever assumption that person carries in their head. And so that over time just builds and builds and builds, to every time you have to go to work to get into your building, you have to do this to go to a park, to go do something relaxing, to go to a bar, all of these sorts of things. And going to Taiwan was amazing, because you sort of, for the first time in 6 months, it was like just this incredible freedom. And it was like, oh, you can go places and nobody's stopping you, nobody's checking you, nobody's kind of in your face all the time. And it's more extreme for foreigners in China, but for all Chinese, it's like that. And I do think it gets people used to a more kind of in-your-face authoritarian way of social management. And that's something that could very easily stay, even if the health codes go away. That kind of, that pressing kind of mass mobilization of local levels of party committees and grid police and so on, who are there to check on you, like that part of things really could stay in a meaningful way, and I think it will. And it's amazing how much that can kind of interfere with your life, and really you just sort of affect your thinking, and add stress in a way that you may not even realize until you get out. So, yeah.
One thing that I've observed and thought a lot about through the pandemic is that for China's 1.4 billion people, for the first time they are feeling the long arm of the state. For a lot of people, they don't, dissidents feel it in a very strong way. But that's a small fraction of the population. With quarantines being enforced in China, a lot of people, including myself, were getting sensors or cameras placed at their door to make sure that you weren't escaping quarantine. I had to, after my reporting trip in Wuhan, I had to quarantine. I was able to do it at home. And there was a magnetic sensor at the door that would ping this woman who was part of sort of grid style management in China, this community worker, every time my door opened. And she had told me that I could put my trash outside when I wished and things like that. But every time I opened that door to put the trash out or to receive a delivery, she would message me to ask if I'd opened my door, because of course she'd gotten a message saying that I had opened my door. But it really struck me because it's a level of intrusion into your daily regular routine that many people in China have never felt. And there's a new normal in many ways as to how people are adjusting to that. And again, it's not something that's going to go away easily or lightly or quickly. And it's probably here to stay because it has worked so well. There's one question here that I think would be interesting to address, which is, let me see. Do you think the unprecedented response to Dr. Li Wenliang's death could be the start of a new age of dissent in China? This is something that was discussed a lot when he first died, and whether or not this could lead to greater movement in that regard. And there was a big outpouring of grief. There was a lot of people were really upset. He was a martyr. He was somebody who had tried to stand up to the machine, to the government. He was silenced, he was suppressed, and potentially because of the information that he had not being spread further, the pandemic maybe was much worse than it could have been. I mean, there are studies that have been done. The University of Southampton has a study saying that had officials acted 3 weeks earlier, that 95% of the cases, it would have been 95% less. And so there is some work in that regard, but the information that he had and the information that other whistleblowers had at the time could have saved many, many lives. And that's something that, again, is getting glossed over at this point because China is so eager to say, hey, we've won. We've successfully eradicated the virus. We've got 4 candidates in last stage human trials. Like, we're on track. We are going to give the world a vaccine. It's easy to gloss over all of that when they're sending that line out. Paul, I'd be curious actually for what you think, whether or not this could usher in this new age of dissent. I've always thought that with the level of control here is just nearly impossible. And of course, that kind of control is only getting more intense. And if there is any sort of real change, my thinking is that it would have to come at very high elite levels. It's not going to be like a people's revolution or some sort of groundswell of an uprising in that sense.
I totally agree, which probably means we're both wrong. But who knows? No, I mean, I think you're right. I don't see that Li Wenliang moment was incredible, and it does show how brittle at times. We always wonder why the party reacts so intensely to all these tiny little sort of tarnishes of its image or kind of like bits of criticism, and you say, oh, well, they're just being, incredibly sensitive. But there are these moments where you sort of see and that the public sort of opinion just shifts so dramatically, so quickly. And the Li Wenliang moment was one. There was another that was much smaller, but it was just, Huawei, the Chinese telecom company had sort of basically forced a few people to be thrown in prison for more than a year based on, some very random discussion about their business with Iran. And when the people got out, the Chinese police basically said we wrongfully held these people. And when it became sort of known that Huawei had been behind this, the entire Chinese public turned on Huawei. And, this is the sort of pride of China, the national champion, the thing that the sort of government is fighting for around the world. And here you have everybody on Chinese social media just blasting the company. And so there is a sort of ability for Chinese public sentiment to change very, very fast. And you do kind of wonder how deeply held some of these nationalist opinions are by many people. At the NBA scandal, when there was that whole sort of fight about the NBA and Daryl Morey's support for Hong Kong, I went to the game in Shanghai, which was the sort of first game after that, and most people didn't actually care about it. They said they did. They said, oh yeah, I'm really upset. The NBA should apologize, but they clearly didn't care. It was purely lip service. And so there is a lot of that going on. But at the end of the day, I do think that, if there were ever to be something like that, it would probably come from above. And one interesting thing is that in many ways, the young people are actually more pliant. And I had a friend in Wuhan who volunteered. He was just bored of being kind of locked in quarantine all day for so many weeks, and so he volunteered for his local grid policing to kind of deliver food and to his sort of building and organize the relief efforts. And he said it was really interesting because the older people were the difficult ones to deal with, the ones who were breaking the rules and pushing them, but the younger people were all completely compliant. The younger people were very easy to control, and I thought that was a really interesting insight. Because, to some degree, those people were kind of spoon-fed a much deeper, more nationalist, education growing up, and they were given, online, they've been sort of dealt a sort of virtual sort of reality, a sort of internet world that is very heavily nationalist, and so it's very hard to break through. And so, I don't know, I guess I just don't really see it. But it is interesting to see how quickly people can change their opinions in China. And so I think that's probably one of the things that scares the living daylights out of the party.
There is a debate as to whether or not that kind of suppression comes from a place of weakness or a place of strength, and what kind of effect that has in terms of actually keeping long-term stability for the Chinese Communist Party. For the party here, the most important thing is that it stays in power, because the way Xi Jinping has projected himself is that he thinks he is, of course, as the leader, the one best poised to make decisions for this entire country of 1.4 billion people, and there's no potential other alternative. And so it's a huge debate. It's without being a fly on the wall in Zhongnan, without being able to get that kind of inner knowledge of how the CCP is discussing these things itself amongst its most elite members. It's really hard for us from the outside to tell whether it is from a place of weakness or strength. And, I've looked at China for a long time. I go back and forth on what I think about that. But so far, it's worked. The Communist Party is still around. They're still most definitely in power. They're still in charge. They're not going anywhere. So maybe it just comes from a place of strength. Paul, do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't know. It's sort of
debate, right? It's just
there's no. I don't know that there's a good answer one way or the other. I do think when you look around, it's easy. It's easy from our position to see the party as omnipotent because they feel so big and powerful, and it would be easy to imagine 6 old men in Zhongnanhai looking at each other, watching China, half of the country be on complete lockdown, and the entire internet basically burning down the country over the death of this doctor, and saying, holy shit, what are we going to do? And so I think, to try and sort of put your, jump into Wang Huning's, brain at that exact moment, it would look pretty scary from the other side as well, right? And so obviously, there is a lot of overreaction and there is a lack of confidence from the Chinese leadership. And I think part of that comes from not really necessarily being convinced themselves that they have any kind of mandate at all, right? Everything is always about mandate because there's no natural ability to have a mandate because it's fundamentally, an authoritarian government. And so maybe that's just sort of where it comes from. If you didn't earn your place at the head of the table, then you're always going to be afraid that somebody else is going to take it. And if you don't know that the other people at the table really want you there, then you're always going to be afraid. So I guess that's how I think about it. But yeah, it's a tough one. One thing I saw that I think is interesting is sort of kicking ahead to the Olympics in 2022. And both the sort of nationalism and the xenophobia, and whether, there's been any efforts to sort of curb that back, and what will happen in the next kind of 2 years as this plays out. And I'm curious, Sophia, I've been gone now for 4 months, so I'm hopelessly out of touch. How is it, how has it, do you feel like there's any sense of the government coming in and trying to lessen these things, and do you expect that to happen at some point? What is your sort of take on that?
There hasn't really been any discussion about the xenophobia issue here at all. It's convenient, really, for the Chinese government, for the general public to still think that these imported infections are coming from foreigners. That anti-foreign sentiment, for now, really plays to their advantage. But pretty soon, the Chinese government is going to have to address it more broadly. There are already boycotts from various human rights groups in advance of the Olympics because of human rights violations here in Xinjiang and Tibet against a lot of ethnic minority groups. And that is something eventually Beijing will have to somehow respond to in advance of the Olympics. And I think this period of time will be really interesting. I think one thing that has really struck me about the pandemic is that all of a sudden the quirks of how the Chinese Communist Party works, these issues, for instance, local cadres in this case in Wuhan, there were delays in reporting up the chain, basically. And oftentimes local officials, and you see this in a lot of different cases, not just when it comes to public health issues, local officials are worried about giving bad news to their boss, basically. They don't want to put that up the chain because that could mean they lose out on the next promotion. And so there are certain quirks, and it's all based on these sort of targets, hitting targets. So it's all based on the system here that is just the way things are run. But usually the way things are run here don't necessarily have such global implication. I think for the first time, the way the government is here, the way the party is structured and built, has affected people down. It's come into their living rooms, quite literally. The risks involved with this rise of China under Xi Jinping have suddenly been made so apparent in countries whose political systems are vastly, vastly different. And I think that's something that a lot of countries are thinking about now. You've seen this big divide in terms of where things are. Countries not sure if they want to be on the China side, on the US side, if they want to carve their own way. And I think that sort of fissure was already there before the pandemic, and the pandemic's only exacerbated. It's made it more clear and obvious. And now all of a sudden, a lot of countries, a lot of governments are waking up to see what has actually always been in front of them. The Chinese Communist Party has never been different. It's become perhaps more refined and stronger, but it has never told the world anything other than what it has never given a misleading message into what they were after and what they were all about. It's just that the world, I think, has suddenly woken up to what was always in front of them. And it's really this pandemic that has seeded that. And I think it's interesting because it's, again, the first time sort of really specific internal things to how the Communist Party runs has had an impact on people really, really far away into their homes.
Sophia, how much do you think that turn, because it does feel like we've really seen, especially from sort of, major European countries and, sort of Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, that kind of a turn against China, more kind of sort of vocal opposition. How much do you think it's linked to the virus itself, or actually the kind of after the virus kind of got out, the behaviors? Because I guess, one of the other things, like, how much are people blaming China for the virus, or how much are people pissed off for the lack of kind of, sort of claiming responsibility for the virus and the kind of wolf warrior diplomacy that followed, and these kinds of sort of threats that get issued, and the sort of, PPE stuff, all these sort of parts of the process where people are just getting to know China better, and not so much because of the initial crisis that was triggered by the virus, but because of all of the behaviors and all of the kind of ways that you had to deal with China kind of after that got out.
Yeah, the whole vaccine mask diplomacy, I think it really backfired for China. It was, trying to take advantage of a position of strength at that time after China had dealt with a number of infections here more successfully than other countries. I mean, taking advantage of that relative position of strength was it was a botched move. It didn't play well, I think, with a lot of other countries. It didn't play well because a lot of those countries had donated supplies to China in its moment of need early in the year. And that was also part of why a lot of countries, especially in Europe, didn't have enough supplies at home, enough PPE for their own people when these infections came. I think there was there is some sense, I think, that the virus, that had China done better on the front end, that perhaps it wouldn't have spread so far and wide.
Yeah.
I think by now there's enough, there have been studies on it. There's enough for us to know that that is definitely the case. And in many ways, we may never know the full extent of how much worse it was or how much better it could have been had China been a little bit more forthcoming. Also, to be fair, for any country dealing with this kind of novel coronavirus, it's got to be insane. I'm not a public health official. I can't profess to know what it feels like in those early days, but it's got to be so difficult. So in some ways, I think, okay, give China a little bit of credit in terms of having to navigate that in the beginning, but even still, the sense that they had time to take steps and didn't, I think that's something that a lot of nations would really be interested in trying to determine more clearly as to what exactly happened. I mean, there's been this big push for an international inquiry, and the WHO did send a team, but that team wasn't allowed into Wuhan. There's supposed to be another mission coming, but there's no details as to when and what access they'll have. And so we may never really know what happened in those early days. And in so many ways, as China keeps pushing back against that, it doesn't help their case. And I do think that sort of divide, this distrust that has been seeded, it's going to take a long time if it ever is able to be mollified or changed.
Yeah. And to kind of come back to, something I wanted to address, that idea that, okay, perhaps an authoritarian government is better prepared, or the governmental excesses are better in a moment of crisis. I actually think, yes, if you can turn your country into a prison, you will stop the spread of the virus. But what do you lose in the process of doing that, and what does the actual mean? And if there's that much opacity, you can never actually judge. And I think that's one of the points with the China response and with the responses in other authoritarian countries. The decision to lock down Hubei and Wuhan, how many people actually died as sort of a secondary impact of not having medical facilities, of not being able to leave? If you really wanted to have a sophisticated response, you could have locked things down, but also sort of gotten people out who needed, desperately needed medical care and bring them to other places. Like, you don't need to simply sort of close the borders of an entire place and just say none can leave. There are sort of more nuanced ways to manage it. It felt very sledgehammer when it was happening, and it can look good now when things are sort of more or less have moved on. But I mean, you have to remember there are literally thousands of people who were on vacation when this happened, visiting family, who were trying to get home, who were hunted because they maybe had they were from Hubei, but they had left earlier. All this public trust is sort of in public health crises, public trust is the most important thing. And if you don't trust your people at all, then at the end of the day, people remember that, and people feel that, and people do then sort of keep that in their back of their heads, even if in the end, things were better, they still remember, oh man, we were treated this way. And I remember, in Shanghai, as things were getting better, talking to people, and everybody was very nationalistic about it and said, oh, well, we had to sacrifice, and some people must be sacrificed. And then I remember talking to people in Wuhan or from Hubei, and they were, very different take on things. And the sacrificed often feel like they didn't need to be sacrificed, whereas the people for whom they were sacrificed are happy to have said, oh yeah, they had to do it. So I do think there's a lot of, there are going to be these deep scars that will remain. And so, yeah, how, long-term that impact on society, and the fact that, that own sort of that opacity was sort of reflected broadly and the world saw it, also impacts, China's image and how China is viewed. So, yeah.
I think also in terms of the censorship that occurred in the early days, a lot of these stories, we did eventually, we as a collective public, did eventually get more pictures and details of what was going on in Wuhan, about how overwhelmed hospitals were, but it wasn't the level of reporting that would occur if this had happened, for instance, in a Western country. And in so many ways, even, the information sharing aside from the government, from the government's end, that aside, I think a lot of countries were really unprepared for what was to come, because there wasn't enough understanding of how difficult this was and how quickly people could get infected. And so there was, I I don't want to use the word complacency. I don't think that's the right word, but there was just really a misunderstanding, or really a lack of understanding of what was about to happen. And part of that, again, is because the government could have shared more information, but chose not to.
Right.
And also because there was this crisis that was unfolding in this city of 11 million people, in the broader province, and then for after that, across the country. And without that kind of knowledge and knowing what was happening for other countries, it was difficult to prepare at a moment when they really should have been making those emergency plans for themselves. And I think that's something in the long run that, it's just again, the effect of the consequence of how things are run here, having an impact on the rest of the world. Paul, there's a question here that I think would be great for you to answer, actually. There's Taiwan as a model for successful contact tracing, using essentially, quote, self-surveillance, working with government to create data networks. Do you think this model could be successfully replicated in other democracies? Is there a way that data collection can be done while preserving civic trust? So I think now that you've experienced it in Taiwan, I'd be curious to know how it's gone and how you feel about it.
Yeah, you read my mind. That was exactly what I was going to try to hop to. I think Taiwan's a little unique because it's an island, and so it's easier to kind of, cut off transportation flows. And a key part of Taiwan's response was cutting off transportation flows and then forcing quarantines. It did have to track down some local spread, but not a lot. And once it was under control, they kind of had a system in place very early. And so, a lot of it was very fast action very early on that kind of saved the day. But I do think this virus kind of attacks societies at their weakest points, and it can be different places for different things. For China, the censorship and information control was the thing that allowed it to kind of get out of control. In the US, we see the sort of political polarization and the distrust, sort of being the sort of fissure on which it sort of festers. And I think in Taiwan, one of the things you do have here is just a deep level of public trust, broad social trust in each other, and a broader kind of trust in the government. The Taiwanese wealth gap is relatively low. It's a democratic country. And so, it's easy to kind of put it on the system and say, well, they did a good job. They do, and they do some. There's a couple of interesting things they do. They do basically tap into your cell phone, and when you quarantine for those 2 weeks, they keep an eye on whether your phone is leaving the specific base station that it's pinging. And if it moves, then the police come looking for you and say, why are you breaking your quarantine? But you could leave your phone at home, and some people have, and they've been shamed publicly for it. One guy was training for a triathlon and was going out every day and keeping his times on his watch and posting them to Facebook, and eventually somebody reported him, and he got into all kinds of trouble. But I guess it's a long way of saying there are a bunch of interesting little clever tricks that Taiwan has used, and it's really important that they did those things. But at the same time, you can't overstate how much just having that broad level of social trust and those sort of functioning democratic principles kind of underlied the entire thing. And without those, it would be much harder. If people didn't trust the government tapping into their phones, they might have gotten furious and protested. If people didn't trust each other to kind of keep quarantine, you could see a lot more people going out and doing sort of, accidentally spreading it around. If people didn't listen to the science and didn't wear masks, it could have gotten further out of control early on. So in all these ways, the sort of public trust level does sort of undergird it all. One interesting thing about the Taiwan system as well is they're not really big on testing, and part of it is that they're saving tests in the event there is an outbreak, and there really just hasn't been an outbreak. I think we've had 500 total cases, no community spread in 150 days or something. So it's really remarkable. But in the event of an outbreak, they want the tests sort of at the ready so they can use them. But so there's really not much testing at all. Basically, to get into the country, you come in, you quarantine for 2 weeks, and then a third week you're sort of supposed to sort of socially distance, but you're allowed to go out, and then that's it. And there is no testing. There's no sort of, there is now they're trying to develop a quicker visa where 5 days you test and then you can get out. But that's the extent of the controls. That and a kind of phone tap to watch where you are. So that's not very extreme. That's not like it's not that sophisticated a system in some ways, but it's worked well. And so yeah, I mean, I think it could be exported elsewhere, but all of those tricks wouldn't work if you're in a society that's more broken or sort of has other sort of issues with its government. So I think that's probably the harder part. You know, the invisible part is the difficult part. But yeah.
Okay, I think we've gone through all these questions.
Yeah. So any last thoughts, Sophia? I guess we can close it up in a minute, but I'm curious, you know, what your sort of broader takeaway from all this is, and what you kind of want people to think about going forward.
You know, I think this idea that, you know, China, the rise of China is not a news story by any means, but it's one that I think for a lot of people outside of China have always thought of as a story that's at a distance. And with the pandemic, that has changed that thinking. And again, the censorship, this kind of data collection, the privacy intrusion, the way the Communist Party is stacked and how it works, and it's all its quirks. I mean, these are things, again, in this pandemic, we have really seen really exacerbated in terms of how it has an impact on the wider world. And I think in so many ways, the general public, countries are thinking about China in a very, very different way. And to me, from where I sit here, it does seem like there's a potentially pretty lasting shift in how that will go. Already there were issues with Huawei. There was security concerns in some countries over Huawei. That kind of issue and that sort of risk involved and the concerns and awareness of that's only increased with the pandemic and this broader sort of hawkish China sentiment that we're seeing in a lot of countries. And I do think that puts the world in a pretty dangerous place. There's always talk of whether or not this could turn out to be a physical conflict. It could be a cyber war. I mean, it just doesn't bode well for powerful nations to be at odds with each other. And I spent a lot of time thinking about what that means for the near and long-term future. And it just goes back to this one line that I think for the first time in so many ways, the quirks of China have had an impact on a lot of people around the world. And I think that's something to really think about. And censorship, for instance, here is just not, it's not something that is only at this stage an impact on the people in China. It has wider implications. And I think that is something that really needs to be considered and remembered. Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can zoom in a little bit to China specifically, because I think I do think we touched on this a little bit earlier, but you know, for years covering China, I had tried to understand the grid policing system. You know, and what the grid policing system is basically you divide China up into a big old grid, and each tiny little square has a person in charge, and they're keeping track of who's naughty and who's nice, who's doing what that's bad, who needs to be watched because they keep spouting about how great democracy is. You know, and you keep those lists and you keep tabs on who's poor and who's a drunk and so on, and you kind of put it together, and the idea is that can then flow up to a bigger sort of square and a bigger square. And ultimately, this is how you kind of keep watch over a country as large as China to the sort of level that the Chinese government would want to. And the thing is, we didn't really, I'd been to grid policing places before and it was hard to get them to talk, but it felt like a very irrelevant part of life. Like life was so dynamic and so dominated by the kind of, you know, private industry and the ability to move around the country and the disruptions of all of the economic growth that had happened over years and years, that those sorts of new versions of social control that kind of felt like they cast back to the earlier communist era seemed almost irrelevant and seemed like kind of wishful thinking that they would be relevant again. And what we saw with the virus and the kind of mass mobilization at a very grassroots level of these party officials and volunteers and grid police networks was that this has been tremendously successful as a means of social control. And even if maybe without the virus it never would have been, but by activating those networks in a kind of time of crisis and bringing them into people's sort of everyday life, it did kind of sort of animate this sort of this sort of skeleton of control that was maybe there but not really active. And I mean, I remember, a few different people we spoke with had no idea who their grid police official was, had no idea who the local party committee was of their area, but boy, did they find out during the coronavirus. And boy, were they, their quarantine, Sophia, like yours, was managed by somebody who, wouldn't let them out and was talking to them on WeChat all the time. If they wanted to get out, they might have to volunteer. All of these things were happening. And it is funny because in those places, those parts of very, very local levels, you do see almost this combination of democracy and authoritarianism in China. Building committees will vote on things, and building committees will say, like, we don't want any doctors coming to stay. That was one thing that happened in Hunan was, building committees would sort of vote and say, no, any doctor who lives here is not allowed to come back from the hospital because we're afraid they're going to bring COVID in. And then you'd see sort of the grid police come in and say, no, you can't do that. And so it was these very fascinating moments, and I do think it will change China forever for the foreseeable future, because all of a sudden all of those networks are activated, and now the local governments all know how to talk to those people, all know how to sort of get information from them. Everybody in the local community knows who those people are and respects their authority because it was deployed at this moment of crisis. And so I think that's a really important shift in kind of how Chinese life will sort of go on forward and how governance will happen in China. And I think Xi probably feels fairly emboldened by that success. And so I think it will be very interesting to kind of see what they do with that. But I think we probably have a lot more kind of draconian controls to come, in part on the back of that sort of old style kind of socialist management structure kind of brought anew and backed up now with technology. So I think that's something that I'm kind of looking at that I think will be interesting.
Just one last thing about that is that as COVID has gotten better, all those people that were mobilized for the grid policing system, they've just, there's a new campaign for waste sorting. So glass, metal, paper, plastic. And so that system has just been shifted from COVID quarantine enforcement and, contact tracing over to the waste sorting. And I imagine over the next few years, we're just going to see different government campaigns that these workers are just siphoned over to do. But it was amazing. Just I woke up one day and then went downstairs to my compound. And all of a sudden, the same people who were before in hazmats going around to people's homes to make sure they were quarantining were sorting the trash.
And those campaigns were happening before, but they weren't in anybody's face and they weren't relevant to people because there was nobody was there to enforce it or to do anything, right? And now all of a sudden, they're there, right? It's interesting.
Yeah, really coming to the forefront. Great. I guess I will speak for both of us for a minute, Paul. We're both happy to keep the conversation going. If any of you have other questions, we're on Twitter, so feel free to reach out. And it's for both me and Paul. It's 2 a.m. So thank you for joining. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thanks everybody, and thanks Sophia. This was great. Hopefully we can do it again sometime. Perhaps in Taiwan someday. Yeah,
right. I might be kicked out. Might follow in your footsteps. So never say never. Yeah. All right. Have a good one, guys.
All right. Take care.